In this video, I will cover the increment interface function for the generic interaction component. Now, increment events are very similar to the events we were using earlier, except that they send floats and they're more designed for incrementing or decreasing a value or state in an interaction receiver rather than setting a state. By that I mean the buttons for interact simple modes simply set the state of a thing, but increments are more designed to increase that thing, such as decrease brightness or increase brightness. Here we have the same light as last time with the same interact simple events from before, but we've added these two increment buttons. And their job is to simply decrease and increase the brightness of this light. This setup is achieved by sending an increment interact event as opposed to a simple event. In your interactable, you can forward these two different types of messages. As we see in our buttons here, this button on the left, this blue button, is configured to send an interaction simple event, but these buttons here are set to send an increment interaction event. And in the blueprint, this looks pretty simple. You can send either of these messages by simply typing in interact simple or interact increment, and you'll be given a node that will send this message. As you can see here, simple takes an integer for mode, increment takes a float for increment. As a receiver, you have access to both of these events, and this light, here you'll see the simple light color changing logic that we demoed before in the previous video. But here we have our increment event, and all this does is it takes our increment, it multiplies it by 1,000 because lights need big values and change for intensity to change, and we simply update this intensity. So if we send a -1, we're decreasing intensity by 1,000, and if we send a +1, we're increasing intensity by 1,000, thus making the light brighter. Now with these buttons here, we can change its increment value due to the reusable button being highly configurable, and say if we want this increase button to increase it by a lot, we can say send the value of 10 as opposed to 1. And now when we hit play, we'll be sending an increment value of 10, which in turn increases intensity by 10,000, and our light should become really bright really fast when we press this button, as you can see here. And our decrease button is only decreasing by a tiny amount, so it takes a lot more presses to get the light back down to where it was. Now, these increment buttons can be used for, say, if you have an elevator, if you want to go up a floor, maybe you send an increment of 1. But if you want to go to a specific floor, maybe you send a simple event with the floor number. That way you can have things like a call elevator button. You press the button and the elevator will always return to a specific floor. But if you're in the elevator, you can have a simpler UI where you can just say go up a floor, and it doesn't matter what floor you're on because the increment logic will handle that as opposed to setting a specific floor instead. By combining interact simple and interact increment events, you can achieve very complex behavior by simply having buttons thrown in the world and having the level designers define what these buttons send to the receivable. Then all you need to do is make sure your receivable is set up to behave on simple and increment events correctly and do whatever that thing needs to do, thus separating the trigger and the interactable logic from the actual mechanic that's happening, thus making your game much more modular and easier to maintain.